Tiger saves baby baboon from pack of hyenas. What happened next shocked everyone. The clearing seemed to breathe on its own, compressed between tall grasses and twisted branches, when the savanna revealed its breaking point. A pack of hyenas closed the circle, slowly and surely, around a baby baboon separated from the group by the confusion of tracks and the sweet smell of a distant carcass. The ground vibrated under impatient paws, restless birds streaked the sky with elongated shadows, and fear, an invisible substance, accumulated in every fold of the terrain. It was then that orange streaked the landscape like a bolt of lightning that didn't ask permission. The tiger emerged from the fringes of the grass with a low body, elastic shoulders, a fixed gaze, and disturbed the geometry of the encirclement with a single lateral advance that sent dust and teeth flying. There was no pause for announcement, no negotiation of instinct. The hyena's first charge was met by an arc of muscles that cut across the diagonal of the dominant flank, pushing the group to the edge of the shallow bed of a nearly dry river. The harsh laughter turned into bursts of frustration, and the cub, gripped by panic as if breathing for the first time, oscillated between impossible escape and paralyzing shock. The tiger didn't fixate on the easy prey. It drew a protective semicircle, testing angles and distances, forcing its adversaries to expend energy in a game of approach and retreat that repeated itself 3 times, each return shorter, each retreat more crooked. From a distant jeep, human lenses tried to comprehend the larger pattern, and the larger pattern was simple and impossible. The predator had intervened, not to hunt, but to reorder the hierarchy of that moment. The savanna, accustomed to iron narratives, held a second of silence, as if also searching for meaning. The cub stumbled toward a hollow log, stumbling over invisible foundations. 2 hyenas cut across the path at an open curve, trying to force a mistake. The tiger charged through the middle, its weight compressing the dust into low clouds, and a swipe of its paw turned stone, twig, and intention, bending the attack trajectory away from the small one. The clearing nodded at the collision of events. The adult baboons, still too far away to intervene, sought height and vision. The elderly leader, shaped by seasons of drought and loss, evaluated routes and calculated risks. Below, where scents tell the story before images, the tiger scented the west wind, calculated the short shadow, heard the growing chorus of the pack, and chose the corridor of compacted earth as a containment line. By forcing the hyenas across the stony riverbed, it reduced the traction on their paws and widened its own range of maneuver. Each feint had the precision of someone who knows the cost of a mistake. Each parry left in the air the promise of a counterattack that came not from fury, but from measured action. The scene escalated when reinforcements of 3 females appeared from the left, attempting to divide the feline's attention and force an opening over the cub. The tiger responded by segmenting the space into invisible lines. A step to the right, half a body forward, the tail drawing the rhythm that determines the tempo of the fight, and the entire body finally launched not at the cub but at the void where the first bite should have occurred. The hyenas misread, advanced into nothingness, and received dust in their eyes, stones on their knees, and the deep rumble that emerges from the chest of a force that knows exactly where and when to occupy the world. The cub gained a 3-beat advantage, enough to reach the hollow trunk and bury itself in the safe darkness that smells of sap, ants, and cold night. The pack retreated 2 steps, not out of surrender, but out of mathematics. They needed to summon more voices, reorganize their strategy, divide the opponent's energy into a wider siege. The tiger, panting in a controlled rhythm, maintained its tall posture on the broken termite mound, eyes scanning the edges of the landscape, ears like bowls focused on the immediate future. The entire savanna held its breath, and it was there, at the apex of an improbable balance, that the sentence of fate was written in the sand. Tiger saves baboon cub from pack of hyenas. What happened next shocked everyone. It wasn't a conclusion. It was a turning point. The sun, already oblique, cast shadows longer than courage, and each shadow carried with it the memory of past attempts, repeated losses, unwritten rules that afternoon, dared to be bent. The tiger descended a half step, not to attack, but to secure the corridor between the trunk and the river. The baboon leader adjusted her column on the nearest fig tree, summoning the troop with short signals, and the wind brought, for the first time, the distant echo of additional laughter. Nothing there promised peace. It promised only consequence. The human cameras, tiny in the face of the vast, sought alignment, and the vast offered a riddle with no immediate translation. When the dust finally settled, the map of the moment showed 3 certainties. The cub was alive, the pack had not accepted defeat, and the tiger, marked by discreet scratches, had chosen a role that didn't fit into easy stories. The climax had been merely the opening. To understand what had bent instincts and protocols, it was necessary to go back in time, trace footprints, read the silences, tell the time. 12 hours earlier, the savannah had looked different. The morning had dawned shallow and translucent, the light streaming through the blades of grass as if the savannah were stretching lazily before the heat. The valley seemed a contented organism. Insects marked regular rhythms, birds traced predictable trajectories, and the air carried only familiar scents of warm earth, resin, and sweet pulp. In the canopy of an ancient fig tree, the troop of baboons organized their routine like the gears of a clock. Adults scanned the edges of the field with their eyes, young females shared the task of cleaning each other's backs, cubs learned the balance between play and caution, and the elderly leader, with scars that counted seasons, controlled the rhythm with imperceptible gestures. The contrast with what would come next was stark. At that early hour, everything seemed to fit the mold of normalcy. In the distance, a group of hyenas crossed the horizon with a patrolling cadence, moving like broken patches across the golden grass. They were a constant presence, as predictable as the shadows of the clouds, and therefore disregarded as they maintained their long stride and slack attention. Further away, invisible in the silence and wind, a lone tiger roamed a shadowy corridor, tracing the terrain with a map of scents read only by it. There was no rush in its movements, only the restrained geometry of someone gathering information, comparing tracks, testing the air to understand boundaries and opportunities. At the opposite end of the landscape, a jeep with human observers stood fixed on a high vantage point, choosing angles, supporting lenses, searching for material for a story that, at that moment, didn't yet exist. The morning's gears turned a few turns smoothly until the trigger aligned with small imbalances. A piece of carcass stubble, too light to promise serious combat, had been dragged from the previous night near a stone corridor. The scent of ancient protein mingled with the sweetness of the fig tree, creating a strip of interest that crossed the baboon's route. In a common slip, a cub's curiosity overcame the safe distance established by the group. It descended from the canopy, jumped onto smooth, still-cool stones, and approached the new scent carried by the breeze. The leader noticed the oscillation in the route late. The call she would have emitted on other occasions became a silent adjustment, because everything still seemed under control. It was in this microscopic delay that the line of calm broke. The hyenas, previously on a reconnaissance march, aligned their column with the rocky corridor. The topography formed a funnel, and the cub, further distracted by the bright outline of a shallow stream, advanced far enough for a dominant female to register the opportunity. The rupture didn't happen as an explosion, but as a slow folding of conditions. The distance between the cub and the center of the pack increased by 2 paces. The scent trail of the stubble drew curiosity in the wrong direction. The wind changed direction and carried with it the cub's signature. The pieces fell in the precise position for the collective error. The first strange signs emerged in details that didn't scream, only insisted. The tiger, which could track the direction of the antelope herd to the east, fixed itself in a semicircle that mirrored the cub's trajectory, measuring the rocky corridor with the patience of someone observing a chessboard. Instead of taking advantage of the general distraction to hunt, it stopped 3 times, raised its head calculatedly, and retreated a few steps, as if confirming escape points and blocking zones. To the ordinary reader, it looked like a simple patrol. To a closer look, the behavior was out of character. The baboon leader, upon noticing the cub's absence, didn't immediately panic. She chose to reorganize the base, leading the group to an adjacent canopy and seeking height for a broader assessment. This cautious approach lost another handful of seconds. Territorial birds, which would normally burst into disordered alarm calls in the presence of the tiger, remained suspended in a rare kind of observational silence, as if needing to grasp the context before responding. The observer's jeep, invisible to most of the protagonists, interpreted the scene as a common savanna morning. Predators on one side, primates on the other, opportunists in the background. The initial resistance to interpreting it correctly was natural. Everything seemed to fit into familiar narratives. The cub, between the shimmer of the shallow water and the promising scent of the stubble, advanced another meter, and the hyenas drew a gentle curve to test it, without triggering the pride's alarm. The elderly leader then noticed something subtle. The footprints in the dust didn't trace the tiger's hunting run, but rather a radius of cover that intercepted the cub's possible trajectory toward the funnel. She adjusted the formation, pushed the group into a shady branch within sight of the corridor, and prepared a lateral shift. The plan was to retrieve the cub without breaking cohesion, but the terrain, with its stone steps and thin crevices, conspired to delay. On the plains, seconds delays are considered bad decisions. The pack, sensing the pride's hesitation, attempted a greater advance, still measured so as not to trigger collective defense. The cub responded to the indecipherable noise with curiosity, not fear, and this opened the remaining fold. The tiger, now halfway up the slope, fixed his gaze on the edge of the funnel and changed his cadence, giving the scene a new pattern that none of those present had rehearsed. The wind shifted again, bringing the cub sent back to the center of the clearing. The natural clock marked the hour when the day ceased to be ordinary. The refusal of those present to accept the anomaly persisted for a few more moments. Distant antelopes continued grazing. Hunting birds remained in high orbit. The jeep adjusted its focus in the opposite direction, expecting the classic chase. Only when the tiger's shadow intercepted the hyena's shadows, drawing a warning on the ground that didn't fit in their repertoire, did reality begin to shift. The cub was no longer so close to the pride, the hyenas were no longer content with patrolling, and the tiger no longer seemed interested in the antelopes. The savannah, which had awakened under the sign of the predictable, entered a different grammar. In the short horizon of mid-morning, the sequence of small choices had woven the breaking point. The pride accelerated the recovery of the perimeter, but not enough. The hyenas reorganized the curve, confident in the topography. The tiger deliberately repositioned itself to cut the funnel line. The situation that would later explode in the clearing was quietly established. A cub at risk, a pack under siege, a predator tasked with a role no one would have assigned it. The sun rose, the shadows shortened, and the world prepared unknowingly for the afternoon when the savannah would shatter its expectations. Midday settled a harsh glow over the valley as the central evidence began to form on the ground like a sentence written by many paws. The cub's footprints intersected with semicircles of hyena claws, and parallel to them were deeper, more rhythmic marks from the tiger, always at an intercepting angle, never on a capture route. There were grooves where the feline had slid its paw to dislodge stones from the path, and grooves in low tree trunks that betrayed observation stops. On a patch of fine sand, an unmistakable pattern. The tiger's stride had interfered precisely with the curve where the cub would have entered the rocky funnel, as if an invisible ruler had measured the minimum protective distance. This silent cartography presented the baboon leader with the first solid revelation, a concrete piece that defied the collective reading instinct. The predator wasn't chasing, it was intervening. The pack received the news not as a certainty, but as a threat to the logic that sustained their vigilance. Young males, inflated by recent vigor and the vivid memory of past losses, descended 2 levels into the fig tree and puffed out their chests, projecting territory with gestures that outlined the old equation of a single enemy. Denial took shape in the ferocity of those who need the world to remain simple to maintain cohesion. The leader herself, though confident in her reading, delayed a gesture of total withdrawal so as not to fracture discipline. At the edges of the scene, birds of prey descended slightly, summoned by the rumor of imminent conflict, and the observer's jeep swiveled its lenses in search of the predictable scene that would justify the usual script. The hyenas, sensing the fissure between perception and proof, quickened their lateral pace and tested the edge of the dry riverbed, giving the shadows the outline of a threat that seemed, finally, familiar to all. The protagonist's isolation fell not on an individual, but on the evidence itself. The footprint map, the wind calculation, the guard posts, all of it hung suspended like a riddle few cared to translate. The elderly leader, descending a branch and cautiously touching the ground, dragged her tail over the sand to preserve her reading of the ground, but the dust kicked up by the impatient youngsters erased some of the signs. The tiger, perched high, watched the micro-tragedy of understanding with the impassivity of someone who only responds to what the landscape dictates. Even though his role on the board was clear in the markings, the public mask of villain remained intact, sustained by generations of narrative and a social choreography that required fixed roles to survive. The pack, despite distrusting the more complex design, retreated to their usual language. Height, perimeter, stones in hand, eyes fixed on the stripes. The hyenas protected this denial like someone watering a plan. They emitted short laughs, shifted positions, kicked up dust, and above all, staged the hunt in the void to force everyone to look in the wrong direction. When one of them advanced until it almost touched the hollow trunk that held the cub, the tiger traced the space with a sharp movement that wasn't intended to bite, but to impede. A stone rolled, a cloud of dust rose, and the line on the ground repeated the same thing no one wanted to admit. Still, 2 male baboons launched a false offensive to ward off the predator, descending the slope with tense muscles and silent screams that only the body emits when reason fails to overcome fear. The gesture, futile and noisy, gave the pack the chance to circle around from behind and test the integrity of the pride's left flank. The jeep, now close enough to capture scratches on the tiger's shoulder and thick saliva at the corners of the hyenas' mouths, recorded everything through the lens of expectation. The ready-made narrative, however, didn't fit. The predator didn't bite. The opportunists behaved like strategists. The primates were torn between the leader's prudence and the young one's rashness. The ordeal, multiplied in layers, crashed against the wall of collective denial and crumbled into dust beneath the passing bodies. With each frustrated charge of the pack, the tiger reoccupied the same protective arc. With each step of the young ones, the reading of the terrain lost its shape. The leader, sensing the erosion of meaning, returned to the canopy and reorganized the column with short signals, trying to weld cohesion without violating the pride that sustained the group's courage. The veiled threat then changed direction. Beyond the main chorus, smaller voices emerged from the valley floor, an echo of thin laughter announcing distant reinforcement. The wind carried the warning over the grass and settled it like a weight on the chests of all those still resisting the idea that this afternoon would not obey ancient formulas. The pack, confident in the weariness that denial would produce, expanded the semicircle and marked small paw trenches in the ground at the edge of the dry riverbed. The tiger, in turn, redesigned the space with 2 more minimal repositionings, preserving the corridor between the trunk and the bank, accepting the cost of a role not granted to him by the Savannah Assembly. On the map of tension, the protagonist, the uncomfortable truth, stood alone. The test lay in the ground, in the wind, in the movements, in the economy of blows. Yet the community looked elsewhere, searching for old certainties. The villain's mask, glued together by habits and memories, remained unbroken in the hurried gaze. Overhead, the sun was dimming slightly, and with it, the urgency took on harsher contours. The cub breathed in shallow cadences within the trunk. The leader consolidated the formation for a cautious retreat. The young men sought larger stones as if needing weight in their hands to sustain a belief. The tiger waited, motionless and feverish, in the center of a pattern that would only make sense when the next inevitable step forced everyone to face the reality the ground had already been telling them from the beginning. And on the horizon's edge, the promise of more hyenas tied the immediate future to the thread of a decision no one could postpone any longer. The afternoon progressed with the precision of someone drawing a compass on the ground, and the investigation ceased to be intuition and became method. The baboon leader, still weighed down by the previous reading, descended cautiously and began to scan the terrain as if piecing together pieces scattered by invisible hands. She mapped the wind direction, compared the freshness of the footprints, and gauged the distance between the hyena's braking marks and the tiger's stopping points. Every detail suggested a unique logic. The feline wasn't moving in a hunting line, but in a covering arc. The hyenas didn't improvise, climbing calculated siege steps. The reorganized pack executed short lateral movements, maintaining sight of the hollow trunk and the rocky corridor, while 2 young men were sent to the rear to monitor the slope and cut off any possible bypass attempts. Overhead, soaring birds lowered their altitude slightly, as if the sky also wanted to compare sides. Nature presented discreet allies. A brief rain, more promise than relief, erased old scents and leveled the reading field, favoring those who relied on visual cues over olfactory ones. The surface of the dry riverbed took on a dull sheen, making the hyena's insistent approach slippery. A jackal, mindful of its own interests, meandered down a side trail and unintentionally diverted the pack from a blind spot that would have brought it closer to the trunk. And a group of mongooses, in a coordinated run, crossed the clearing with enough noise to betray an approaching flank, offering the baboon troop valuable seconds to adjust. Even the wind, which had been betraying the little one by carrying its scent to the opposing semicircle, wavered and began to break into eddies between termite mounds, disrupting the opportunists' reading. The accumulation of evidence grew in layers. In the new mud, the tiger's marks showed sequential stops in the same line of sight as the trunk. In the gravel, V-shaped grooves indicated paw strikes that repositioned rocks to create obstacles. In the grass, shallow corridors revealed that, when not attacking, the feline directed the traffic of threats like someone closing and opening floodgates. In contrast, the hyenas left a nervous legacy. Short, repeated strides, micro-pits at the edges of the riverbed, failed leaps where the rain had thinned their grip. The human observers, previously stuck to a pre-established script, began to record the strangeness with new focus, and the guides, veterans of seasons of drought and abundance, shifted positions high up the slope for a better vantage point. The mask of the tiger's pre-assigned role developed noticeable cracks, not out of a desire for redemption, but due to the coherence imposed by the terrain. It was then that the turnaround materialized in its most dangerous form: the allies' confident mistake. A young male, dissatisfied with the cub's slow recovery, decided to break formation to pull him from cover. He descended diagonally across the gravel strip, carrying urgency like a flag, and exposed the pack's flank at the worst possible point. The pack, waiting for a lapse in cohesion, responded with precision. Two females advanced in a scissor attack, one to distract the tiger's guard, the other to cut off the youngster's return route. The reckless action created a breach where there was none and momentarily reversed the advantage gained by reading the terrain. The ally, unwittingly, became an accomplice to the opposing team's geometry. The threat escalated methodically. The pack expanded the semicircle and, supported by the damp ground, attempted a three-step siege: measured frontal pressure, a lateral cut, and an invasion behind the hollow tree trunk. The tiger, until then a restrained guardian, accepted the price of attrition and shifted from presence to collision. He repositioned himself with two short leaps, occupied the space between the tree trunk and the bank, and, like someone drawing negative lines, forced the hyenas to choose less efficient corridors. A controlled skid from the feline dispersed enough rocks to halt the stride of the boldest attacker. A subsequent advance and retreat created the illusion of space, luring another into the trap of loose gravel. With each passing second, the playing field tilted again toward the cub's protection, but the cost was etched on its body. Superficial scratches multiplied the tiger's pain map, and its breathing, previously barely audible, became heavier. The baboon leader realized the short window between error and rescue and led the troop in pincers. One wing maintained altitude to keep watch, the other descended behind a fallen termite mound, planning the retreat corridor. The cub, sensitive to the ground tremor, adjusted its position inside the trunk, reducing the exposure of its rump to the entrance. The jeep repositioned its silhouette, not to intervene, but to record the evidence of a paradigm shift that would require context when the dust settled. The savannah, for a long moment, was left to the mathematics of attrition. Whoever controlled the attrition controlled the destiny. The cracks in the traditional villain's mask became visible fissures when the tiger refused an easy opening to bite and preferred to maintain the blockade that protected the cub. The consistency of that behavior, repeated over the last few hours, dismantled lazy narratives and forced the collective gaze to acknowledge a different role than expected. It wasn't an unlikely friendship or a sentimental fable. It was a logic of territory and order that afternoon, used the predator's strength to prevent the collapse of the small life exposed to organized opportunism. Even so, the climb did not relent. The hyenas summoned two more members from the valley floor. The meager chorus turned into a broken roar that vibrated to the bone. The reckless young baboon, realizing late the size of the crevice he had created, sought refuge behind a boulder, repositioning himself so as not to compromise the retreat. The tiger, measuring his wear and tear, maintained his guard and shifted the axis of the confrontation once again toward the riverbed, where the terrain favored him. The leader, solidifying the plan, marked the return route in the group's memory. Climb the adjacent fig tree, use the hollow trunk as a way station, bypass the termite mound, and avoid the depression where the gravel turns to mud at dusk. As the sun began to bend its light, the board was set for the outcome no one could avoid. The investigation became strategy. Allies had emerged, some of flesh, others of wind and water. The network of evidence maintained the thesis of protection, and the ancient mask at last showed undeniable cracks. The great turnaround, an ally transformed into a risk, had left its scar, and the threat, now declared in number and method, hung like a blade over the next step. The scenario demanded public exposure, for it no longer fit behind the scenes of the vegetation. The inevitable confrontation called to the clearing as its stage, and the savannah, aware of the memory it would hold, prepared its spectators. What would come would not be mere shock, it would be catharsis. Dusk opened the clearing like a natural amphitheater, and the savannah, summoned by the rumor that had spread all afternoon, piled witnesses on tree trunks, termite mounds, and slopes. The shallow riverbed reflected a sheet of golden light, and at center stage, the roles were finally clear. On one side, the reorganized pack, with dominant females tracing concentric arcs in the damp gravel. On the other, the tiger, wounded in discrete spots, but intact in its cadence, alive in the logic that had sustained the day. Above, the fig tree supported the troop of baboons in retreat formation, with the elderly leader steadfast in a commanding posture and the cub sheltered in the hollow trunk like a heart hidden within the body of the scene. The human presence, distant enough not to break the thread of nature, but close enough to be an audience, completed the public frame where the truth could no longer be hidden. The pack attempted to impose the classic script with the precision of previous times. Contained frontal pressure, a lateral cut, and a stealthy opening through the shadowy flank. The treacherous surface of the riverbed, polished by the brief rain, demanded meticulous attention. Even so, the hyenas relied on numbers, relays, and the arithmetic of those who wear themselves down to failure. The tiger responded by occupying the space as if riding with their body. A full step toward the edge where the gravel gives way, a half turn that sends the attacker skidding, two retreats that promise a window and close it at the exact moment the jaw seeks purchase. Each movement had purpose and memory, and the memory was now collective, as the clearing watched, absorbed, and judged. The first decisive impact came in an oblique collision that disarticulated the leader of the charge and scattered dust in a low cloud. The second, in a short leap that didn't hunt, merely blocked the trajectory aimed at the cub's trunk. The bodies drew invisible lines, and the drawing no longer allowed for mistakes. The mask's fall was a series of coherent gestures that repeated themselves until the denial lost its hold. The hyenas, realizing that the route to their smaller prey was invariably intercepted, adapted their ambition. They traded their immediate objective for a perimeter collapse, trying to isolate the tiger from the pride above. The strategy almost worked when one of them managed to open a corridor along the dry bank, but the feline tore through the diagonal with measured force, accepting the contact, offering its shoulder to the impact to maintain its axis of protection. The cost inscribed scales of pain on the striped skin, and yet the economy of movement remained, as if the body knew that true victory lay not in domination, but in holding. In the background, the savannah synchronized its breathing with the cadence of the confrontation, and the certainty settled in the air that that afternoon had changed its grammar. Catharsis arose the moment the cub, guided by vibrations only he could hear, left the shelter of the trunk for the embrace of roots extending higher, at the foot of the adjacent fig tree. The elderly leader opened the way with her gaze and posture, and the line of retreat finally existed as a concrete path, no longer a hypothesis. The tiger, sensing the transfer, shifted the combat away from the axis of escape, expanding the range of action in the riverbed and drawing upon itself the weight of the pack's relay. The involuntary audience, birds, ungulates, rodents, people, breathed a tense relief in unison, and the clearing, witness, and tribunal recognized the greater meaning of what was materializing. The hyenas, disorganized by a chain-like stumble on the strip of loose gravel, suspended their attack as if catching breath and calculation, and in that interval the truth had already set in stone. Protection had overcome opportunistic hunger in that slice of the world. The consequences began with the sun still high on the horizon, when the pack opted to retreat to a ridge of dry land to count numbers and lick their frustrations. The tiger fully engaged in. Its chosen role did not pursue, did not convert victory into prey, did not turn the moment into revenge. It retraced its perimeter, examined the bed, checked the cub's trail with its nose, and only then did it accept the fatigue its body was taking. The baboon troop consolidated its retreat in two stages. First, the orderly ascent that restored cohesion to the troop. Then, the retreat in a semicircle, maintaining its view of the stage as if giving thanks from a distance. The pain of the innocent showed in the tense muscles, in the belated tremors, in the shallow breathing that affects young and old after a storm. It also appeared in the tiger's scratches, fresh scars that told the price of maintaining a line that was not its own out of obligation, but out of coherence with the design of the territory. The larger savanna community reacted with silent adjustments. Antelopes resumed grazing, keeping an eye on the riverbed. Soaring birds redesigned routes to follow the orange shadow with newfound respect. Small predators avoided the strip that had once been their guard duty. The human presence, which had seen and recorded the unthinkable, shifted its gaze. The lens that had previously sought a ready-made narrative now bent to the complexity that the ground had written without the need for metaphors. Justice came not as punishment, but as a reorganization of meaning. The pack, deprived of prey and its route, took with it the bitter lesson that numbers and method don't always win when space and the reading of the landscape are not in their favor. The symbolic closing occurred when the light faded and the shadows grew as long as a river. The tiger climbed 3 rungs of a termite mound and, from above, watched not the enemy, but the continuity of what he had defended. The distant baboon leader anchored the pride in a sister fig tree and cared for the cub as if marking its place in the world once again. Between these 2 points, the savannah laid down the mantle of reinvented normality and returned its inhabitants to their daily lives with an added memory. The final message, voiceless, unadorned, was etched in the relief. Truth always finds a way, and sometimes it chooses the least expected body to traverse the chaos. The day closed the cycle opened by the climax of the beginning, and everything that had been a sign, a test, a denial, and an escalation now belonged to a single design. What happened next impressed everyone not because it betrayed nature, but because it revealed it in one of its rarest forms, the strength that does not devour the weak, but protects the minimal order that allows life to persist.